tell us a little bit more about Empower Work and what it does.
Really the full spectrum of you're navigating something that's complex and it's tied to your livelihood. And this is really the core of a lot of our well-being is what's happening at work. And so Empower Work is really focused on how can we ensure that folks have the resources, the support, and the structures to help them thrive.
They find Empower Work one way or another. Technology like AI, what do you think is driving job losses in this demographic or in general?
Action in adopting AI, and that's actually going to be compounded. So it's like if there's a downturn, companies are going to look at where they can save money. Labor is a way that they can minimize costs, and then they can adopt AI more rapidly.
If you treat your employees well, you're going to be a higher performing organization and operation, which was really your point.
What's a reasonable expectation for an employer? It's like a great working environment. It's like meaningful work. It's connectivity. It's like you want that pay equity. Like you want the elements that align with what a workplace should provide.
Let's talk about this. You said before we started recording that you are a recovering academic. And I would love to hear what that means and how you recovered.
The thing for me, when I first thought about the beginning of my career, it was like, okay, what am I good at? And how can I use where I have skills to affect positive change in the world? And so when I first started that sort of career journey, it was a little bit of a like, let me take some guesses at this, and I landed on sort of like, okay, my way to make an impact in the world using the skills that I have is teaching and writing. That's the path that I can pursue. And so I wanted to go in and into academia and become a professor and work with students and really think about how research and learnings can inform current policy and social change. And that was the path that I thought was most aligned with my expertise at the time. And I started, that path. I got a master's degree. I was working at the Kennedy School for a little while and then started a PhD program. And very soon into the PhD program, I was like, nope, this is not for me. And then it was a real question of like, okay, well then what is next for me? And what does that look like? And so I applied to what felt like hundreds of jobs and didn't hear back from anybody. And a friend of mine said, hey, there are a couple of roles open at this organization. You should apply. I applied. Similarly, didn't hear back. She went and knocked on the door of the HR hiring manager, who then took a call with me and said, you're applying for the wrong jobs and your resume is structured kind of the wrong way. And, she gave me a lot of really, I would say, tough but fair feedback. And then she said, based on what you told me about yourself, we have this other role that's not posted yet. Would you be interested? And I mean, I'd sort of like laugh. I mean, this totally dates where this was, but it was a web content editor position, and it was like, okay, you're going to be editing the website. And so they were hiring for someone who was a really good writer to do that, who had some technical expertise or like at least was comfortable with technology. And I was like, okay, I know some HTML and I'm a pretty good writer. So that role ended up being at the forefront of the organization's thinking about what does a digital presence look like. And so I had the real opportunity to be an entrepreneur and think creatively about what do digital channels look like to move the organization forward? How do we use a lot of like emerging platforms at the time to think about elevating the work and thinking about technology and communications in a different way? It was a really exciting and I think foundational part of my career to get a chance in a huge and like well-established organization that worked in, at the time over 25 countries with over 1,000 staff in various parts of the world to really experiment with new technologies in a way that I probably wouldn't have gotten a chance to do otherwise.
And you never really looked back from the social impact work that you were doing. That was really your first entry out of academia.
Yeah. And I mean, there have been opportunities at other points to jump into other possible paths, career paths, especially when I moved out to the Bay Area. it was a real reflection point for me that, do I want to stay in the social impact realm? Do I want to stay in social impact, but take a different tack around that? Maybe move into corporate CSR or, experimenting with ways that you can get at social impact in other ways through government or otherwise. But ultimately stayed more in the, what I kind of consider the like creative side of social impact, where
Mm.
you're working at really, I think in more like entrepreneurial environments to affect change and get really, I don't know, come at things in new ways.
Well, it's interesting that the HR manager that you ended up speaking to ended up giving you career advice, which built the trajectory for your career. And it's maybe no coincidence that now this is what Empower Work is doing for a lot of other people. Not only this, but I'm sure there is some career advice. And I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about Empower Work and what it does specifically for people who are using the service.
Absolutely. So Empower Work is a national organization that provides support for folks who are facing really tough situations. So it could be, situations like I experienced where you have a really gut punch moment and you're really trying to figure out, what do you do in light of a really negative situation that you've experienced? It could be, gosh, I've applied to hundreds of jobs and like I'm not hearing back. This feels really demoralizing and I feel really stuck, about what to do. It can also be positive things like, I just got this job offer, but I've never negotiated a role before. And I'm, feeling a little embarrassed to ask for certain pieces of information that aren't part of the offer. So really the full spectrum of you're navigating something that's complex and it's tied to your livelihood. And this is really the core of a lot of our well-being is what's happening at work. And so Empower Work is really focused on how can we ensure that folks have the resources, the support, and the structures to help them thrive, acknowledging that, for the vast majority of folks across the country, there aren't a lot of resources for that. There are about 40 million Americans who work in places with no HR, much less any other structures of support. And so but then you also think about all the points when you're making career decisions or you're thinking about something that impacted you at work. You're not even going to go to your employer in that situation. You're going to leverage other aspects of resources and support that you might have. So we provide something that up until we existed didn't exist, which is, something that's accessible. It's on your phone. It's easy. You can text someone and talk to a real person, on the bus on the way to work and really work through the situation that you're experiencing so that by the time you walk into wherever your place of employment is, you're like, okay, I've got a game plan. Like I can figure out how to handle this conversation with this toxic manager I've been dealing with, or I've decided I can make it in this role for 6 more weeks. And that's about how long it's going to take me to find another job and manage through it and just show up in the way that I need to show up today and then start my job search. So, it's really about like centering the person and what they need and figuring out a game plan.
And you kind of touched on this already, but can you tell us about the demographic of the users of Empower Work?
Yeah. So we're really structured and anybody can use us. So it's free, it's accessible. Folks can text in or web chat. We don't have any barriers to entry. Like we're not asking people, like, do you meet certain criteria? That being said, we really intentionally partner and do outreach to communities that wouldn't otherwise have resources and support. And so that looks like a variety of industries. We serve folks mostly who are working in really small workplaces. So thinking about like workplaces that are like 50 or fewer. And that can be in manufacturing, that can be in the service industry, that can be really places where people feel like they don't have a place to turn. Not surprisingly, folks across workplaces who are less represented in those workplaces tend to experience more challenges. And so overwhelmingly, we tend to serve folks who identify as women, as people of color, who might come from experiences, whether in differing education backgrounds, or maybe they're navigating a disability and dealing with that at work. So really like situations where folks may not feel like they have the social capital or the structures of support to really deftly navigate in the way that they want to.
And can you maybe help explain, like, you're in this type of environment, you are in a work environment where you don't have access to HR the way maybe knowledge workers do at Facebook or at Google or some of these tech companies that we're familiar with being from the Bay Area. Like what's the life of somebody who's in this situation? Like why Why is this so important for them? Help us paint a picture and understand how Empower Work is impacting them.
Yeah, well, I'll share a story that happened, a few years ago, which is, there was a person who worked in a manufacturing plant, small family-owned manufacturing plant. And we think about manufacturing plants, we often think about like big industrial manufacturing, but there's
Totally.
all kinds of manufacturing that exists, where you could have a, 20 to 30 person manufacturing plant, family-owned, no HR. The person who owns the business is the person who you go to if you have a situation, whether it's like you're dealing with pay or whatever. And in this case, somebody was navigating, feeling like their skills weren't really being fully appreciated in their workplace. Like they were building lots of new things for their employer. And there were a variety of things that were happening that felt really unfair. And ultimately, kind of at the end of the day, the person was like, fundamentally, it just feels dehumanizing. I don't remember what word they used to describe it, but it's something along those lines, because the owner of the manufacturing plant had not responded to folks on the floor asking for the bathroom to be fixed. Like the toilet had been broken for over a year. And yes, there are all of these different things in the workplace that don't feel great. Like they wanted to get paid a little bit more and they wanted their skills to be valued. But just the fact that like, hey, this bathroom had been broken for over a year and like you can't just take a break. I think those are situations that we think, gosh, like how could that ever happen? Like that, of course someone would want to make sure that their employees have access to take a break, but there are these situations that happen. And in those cases, and in this situation, that person, there weren't other manufacturing plants that could engage that person's skills. So you're kind of stuck in a situation of like, do I just manage through this and feel so disrespected every day? Do I move my family to somewhere else that, I can find another job that can use my skills? Do I speak up? But, I kind of already tried to do that and faced, repercussions from that. And so it can feel really challenging in that situation to feel like anyone's on your side or to feel like you have options. And that's what we try to unlock for folks. Is there is a sense of agency in a situation that may otherwise feel like there aren't options.
So like somebody like this might be in a situation where they're feeling like my needs aren't being met. I don't have anybody to speak to. I might even be facing repercussions when I'm like voicing my opinion. They find Empower Work one way or another and are then in a text chat with somebody who's like a partner of theirs in some way. Is that like the right way to think about it?
Yeah, I mean that's like, yeah, we talk about it as like a sounding board, a partner.
Yeah, I don't know the right word, but
Yeah, we asked actually when I was starting Empower Work, we would ask folks like, how would you describe the person you were just speaking to?
Mhm.
Because we were like, do we call it a coach? Do we call it a peer counselor? Is it like
Okay.
a partner? Like what do people perceive it to be? And repeatedly folks who use the service said like it really felt like a counselor. Like it was like, because I feel like people felt like they were getting counseled,
Yeah,
that you're
that's a great word.
you're engaged in this really deeply human and connective experience where the person is really like there, by your side with you through the experience, and their sole interest is the best outcome for you. And that can be tough because you could text a friend, you can text your parents, like whatever, but there, you might get responses that are like, dude, like just quit, You're like, okay, like, yes, my friend's best interest is me, but the way to express that may not be the most helpful, like
Yeah, they may not be trained
advice,
professionals.
So
What
everybody that people talks, everyone that someone connects to at Empower Work has gone through really rigorous training.
can you talk about that training? Like who are these counselors? Who's on the other side of this? Somebody who's facing workplace issues, like you said, you could text your friend and they're going to ask you if you want to grab beers or something, but like not necessarily, it depends on the friend, but like may not be solving the problem. Who are the counselors? How are they trained? How do you pick them?
So we have incredible folks from all over the country, and actually some folks volunteer from around the world. We have volunteers outside of the US as well who might really inclined to give back to their community, but their community happens to be here in the US and they might be working abroad.
Mhm.
So they are typically, they're folks ranging in experience. We have folks who have been chefs or restaurant owners all the way to like, corporate executives, like full
Yeah.
spectrum of different industries and jobs. And they're typically motivated by a sense of sometimes personal experience. They've gone through something hard at work and somebody helped them through it and they kind of want to pay it forward. Some kind of are giving back because it's a way for them to connect in and support people in ways that make sense for them. It's like you can do it on your
Mhm.
couch. You don't have you can do it on your own time. And it's also a really unique opportunity to build skills. So we have a lot of folks who come in and they're like, gosh, I think I'm a pretty good manager, but I want to really build skills in coaching and how to support people. And wow, amazing that I get a chance to help people and give back at the same time. And they're people who really care, they're folks who get excited about, to some extent, problem solving, but also really deeply listening to somebody and helping them move forward. And it's just really a gift to see folks who get involved and raise their hand and they're like, yeah, I want to do this.
I mean, it requires a deep sense of empathy because it's also not a video chat, right? It's not like you're meeting these people in person. Is
Right,
that
right.
correct? So this is
Yes,
just all over text.
it's all over text. And part of, people ask me, like, when I started in power work, well, like, why is it text based? Like,
Mm.
why isn't it a phone call or like video or things like that? And it's really about meeting people where they are. If something happens at work, what's your behavior pattern? You're going to like text surreptitiously out from the side of your workspace, or you're going to, maybe you're thinking about it in the break room, or you're thinking about it on the bus or the train on the way to work. And in those contexts, you don't want to be overheard. And we also find that it's really valuable for folks to have a written format because they can go back to it. They can, practice things with their volunteer, whether it's a conversation they're going to have with their manager or sort of like paths forward. And then they have a reference for it. So we have folks who come back and are like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I like used the language that I practiced with my peer counselor and, was able to kind of practice that before I walked into the conversation with my manager or, whatever the case may be. And so
Oh, that's interesting.
there's a powerful piece of both like where are they and what's the best way to communicate to meet them in the moment. And then there's also the power of, I think, the reflection and the way in which your brain works when you're communicating something in a written format and how you process information. And then you can reference it, which is great.
I mean, it just seems like because this is very popular. I know that you have quite a bit of counselors. I know that you have quite a bit of users that are on this application. I don't know the exact numbers, and if you want to share them, obviously feel free. But I realize you guys are a private nonprofit. But what I'm curious about, and one of the things that kind of stands out to me is you're dealing with a very certain demographic, and then within that demographic, you're dealing with workplace issues specifically. And I know you said to me before that you don't really give legal advice. You have resources, if I understand correctly. I'd love for you to correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't provide legal advice. Why is that? And second, what are you doing kind of instead when it comes to this counseling?
Yeah, so great of a question. And this was something I was really nervous about when I started in Power Work because I did all of this like market research, user research, like
Mm.
and interviewed tons and tons of folks. And I spent a lot of time with lawyers because I was like, oh my gosh, like all these legal issues come up at work. How are we going to make sure that we cover those bases? And over again, employment attorneys and other folks who are very seasoned on the legal side of things were like, oh my gosh, this is so needed. They were like, do you know how
Mm.
many people come to us and we can't do anything about their situation because they're like, actually, what is unlawful is very narrow. There's a very small percentage of situations that people experience at work that's legally protected. But there's this huge array of really negative stuff that people go through that has basically no protection. And so, in situations where people might be part of a union or other communities, there can be elements of protection. But from a legal perspective, specifically, a lot of what people go through doesn't have a course of action. And so we really focused on that gap that there are existing legal resources, especially for, lower wage workers. There are amazing legal aid resources. There are a variety of different groups out there that are already available where people can, call in or sometimes text in and, get counsel in that way. And so we saw an opportunity to really help folks who are navigating non-legal situations. And in the event that something does indicate that there could be a legal protection around, we're really clear on information, the rights in relation to that, and then, applicable resources. A lot of times when people reach out to us, they've already done a lot of that research. and realized like, gosh, I'm experiencing this really awful thing. And I've like looked up what my rights are in the situation. And it really stinks because there's not really much that I can do.
Interesting. The demographic that you're working with is primarily, as you mentioned, like in this lower quadrant in terms of social economic status. And right now, there's politically in 2025 a lot of talk about illegal immigration and people that are working without papers and that sort of thing. I'm curious, given that you're working in the lower wage demographic and there's some overlap between that conversation and that demographic, I'm curious what you're seeing from your counselors and what you're seeing from your users. Insights do you have, or what are some things that you might want to share with us that are interesting for us to know?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that we've been looking into the data around and preparing for. And so similar to other situations that have arisen over the course of Empower work, whether it was like COVID or recession, things like that, we were really attuned to what's the current environment and what people may be experiencing within that. And so as soon as some of the conversations and actions started happening from an immigration standpoint, we started reworking resources that we have that are available to folks and thinking about, okay, what do we need to shift for peer counselors, for volunteers to handle conversations? And we were also really curious if people would even mention, because I think folks who are undocumented or who might be navigating complexities of, like, is ICE going to show up in my workplace? They're probably not, they're savvy enough to probably not mention the word ICE, for example, on SMS, because, we offer support over SMS and web chat and it's confidential. And what we find is that people are really good about not providing any PII, personal information, or like situational information that we were frankly like kind of nervous about when we first started. It's like, oh my gosh, if someone comes in and they're like, hey, like they're sharing all this like really personal information, it obviously impacts the confidentiality of the conversation. And we want to make sure that it's as anonymous and confidential as possible. And we built the technology around that, which is really, really important. So we've been looking for that of like, what would people say if they're worried about this? Like, how would, are we seeing a higher level of fear, or are there concerns about impacts? What we believe is likely to happen, and this is something that I don't have the data from the last couple of weeks, but based off of trends that we've seen in other high stakes situations, we think we're likely to see conversations where someone's coming in feeling really stressed about keeping their job because they may be in a mixed status household where one income earner in that mixed status household may have experienced a deportation. And now they're the sole income earner in a household that was really reliant on two incomes to make bills at the end of the month. And so we think we may see less conversations that are more specifically about ICE at work and more about the impacts of, I'm worried about going to work, so I'm not going to go to work, for example. Or my partner has been deported and now I have to pay bills without that income. So we think that's probably, again, based on like previous data, the types of conversations that we'll start to see. That being said, we pulled together a bunch of resources. So if someone is in a situation where it's like, hey, ICE is out in the parking lot. I mean, they can't enter private workplaces, but like they're out in the they're out in the parking lot, and I'm worried about going to my car. I will say I've also seen really great actions on employers' parts to like put together resources for employees too, where they're like, hey, this is how we would handle it. This is if we see something happening. And so I give a lot of kudos to those employers for being proactive on that side too.
So you guys are very data driven, and I know that that's a big part to you and the way that you're running your business and running your teams. What kind of data are you guys gathering? What kind of trends are you looking for? And then what are you doing with that data? Why are you gathering it?
And I should say we're always really careful to note that like it is confidential. So we're like looking at those trends. It's all sort of larger trends in the data. That's not anything personal. But we can see things sometimes ahead of what might be percolating in some of the lagging data. So for example, last year, we were seeing across the course of 2024, a significant increase in folks coming to us about job loss. And so to give a little bit of context for that, I think in 2018, when we started, it was like less than 10%, maybe like 5 to 7% of total conversation volume was about job loss. And last year it was ticking up to over 40%. And
Wow.
we were like, oh my gosh. I mean, and you think about that in relation to the economic data that we were seeing, or like unemployment is at record low, but we're seeing this huge surge and spike in job loss. Like, what's going on? And so we started digging into that data and doing additional research and kind of coupling the conversation data that we saw with different research methods. So we looked at the trends and what we were seeing, and then we did a whole research set around like, okay, what's driving the job loss? Like, what's going on for folks behind the scenes? And what we discovered was about 78%, or like basically 4 out of 5 workers that are making less than 75K a year were looking for work because they were unemployed, underemployed, or they were really dissatisfied with their current employment. And that doesn't always get captured in larger unemployment data. So, if someone's like, I'm working 2 jobs, they're technically employed, but are they employed at the level that they need to be employed at to, again, pay bills at the end of the month? Are they employed in the ways that are using their skills that feel really good for them? Like, these are what it was telling us was like, there's a lot more job loss that's happening than's really getting captured in the larger data. And in addition to that, people are really, really unhappy in their current work situations. It was also taking people way longer to get a job. So, we were seeing that in the past, it's taken anywhere from like 6 weeks to 3 months to find a job. It depends on the industry, obviously, and that's sort of geography and things like that. But seeing people over 6 months, and we're still seeing conversations right now where people are saying like, I've been job searching for, a year, 18 months. I got a job, then I lost that job too. So we were seeing a softening in the labor market
Mhm.
before, the start of 2025. And then 2025, it just like totally ramped up. In January, unemployment or job loss conversations went up to 46%. And on top of that, an additional 20% were employed but looking for jobs. I mean, that's like 66% of total conversation volume in 1 month was about that. And this was not related to government job losses. These were folks in very different industries. And our whole team was kind of going like, whoa, like what's going on? This is worrisome.
Do you think this is related to economic job loss? Do you think this is related to productivity increases because of technology like AI? What do you think is driving job losses in this demographic or in general?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question, and I will say I don't think that we necessarily have an answer. I think we have some suspicions because they're not necessarily jobs
Hmm.
at this point. The folks that we're primarily supporting, that job loss is not necessarily driven by AI. But I will say I'm concerned about the economic context right now because looking at the current landscape, I think there are a lot of indications that there's going to be an economic downturn. And my kind of fear is that the moment we're in right now, where companies are starting to take on AI in much more robust ways, coupled with an economic downturn, may mean that suddenly there's a lot more action in adopting
Sure.
AI, and that's actually going to be compounded. So it's like if
Mhm.
there's a downturn, companies are going to look at where they can save money. Labor is a way that they can minimize costs, and then they can adopt AI more rapidly. And I think that could create kind of a perfect storm in an unexpected way that really impacts folks' employment in a variety of ways. And I don't think we're going to be able to catch up as quickly to other roles or ways of working around that. So it's an area of caution. But I think what's driving some of that job loss and what someone described as like the job market is frozen. Like there was a period where people were leaving jobs, so that then jobs were opening. There was also hiring, but I think the like instability across the political landscape and everything from like tariffs to just like unstable indications is creating a lot of uncertainty, and employers are responding to that uncertainty. If you're like, I don't know whether these tariffs are going to apply or not apply, how can I make sure that we're buffered against the potential impact? They're trying to find stability in unstable times.
Yeah, I mean, and the increase in cost from tariffs, of course, is real, but the increase in cost just based on the devaluation of the dollar and the inflation of goods and services is also affecting disproportionately this demographic that we're talking about right now that your uh, firm is serving. What do you think the impact of inflation is on this demographic, and it knowing that it disproportionately affects them? Like, what does that mean for the employment and also really just like the lifestyle, like just being able to go to the grocery store? Like, how much are you interacting with these folks, and how much of that is coming up, and how much of that maybe isn't directly related to the employer, but it's obviously all mixed in together when your livelihood comes from the vocation you have?
Fundamentally, what we see when folks reach out is there's a high degree of emotion around the fact that the key way in which they're providing for themselves, for their family, is in some way not working for them. So it might be under threat, like job loss. It might be a fear of job loss, like, hey, I'm seeing a bunch of layoffs going around. I'm worried about how it's going to impact, my job, my industry, things like that. But that economic concern, the financial concern, the like, can I put food on the table for my family? Can I, find a next job fast enough because the
Totally.
bills are piling up? Like that is a huge driver of anxiety, of fear, of a lot of the complex emotions that we see coming in. And that's how we're really structured, is to address both the emotional elements. And when people think about work, I think we have this kind of cultural expectation of like, well, we're like gonna like deal with work in the way that we deal, it's like it's not emotional, it's work and things like that. But I mean, the reality is we spend the majority of our lives at work. Work is the way that we derive, the ability to help care for our family, as well as our sense of like who we are in a lot of ways, and the pride and the agency that comes from. So I think when we see the concerns that are driving, we're really focused on how do we alleviate the concerns and the fear that may be happening. And then when I look at the conversations that are talking about like inflation and how it's impacting folks, last year when there was the conversation about like, okay, the price of eggs, that's really real, right? Like someone doesn't have
For
enough
sure.
money to cover the rising cost of groceries. That's totally real. And then you look kind of upstream, and to your point, like all of these pieces are interrelated. Like if you're, yes, wages have been rising to some extent over the last few years,
Okay.
but so has the cost of everything else. And and the structures of work haven't felt good for people for a long time. Like work wasn't working for people before COVID. And then COVID happened, and there were all kinds of, ramifications economically and across industries for that. And we just haven't, I think we haven't figured out, amidst all of the ways in which we could structure what good employment and good working conditions look like we haven't figured that out for folks. And I think we have an opportunity to do that in new ways, but I think we're a long way from that right now.
I want to talk about fair and equitable workplaces and what you can do at any level of work, knowledge work, manual work, whatever it may be. But before we do that, you have a history background, and we're talking about something that has been documented in history over and over again, which is the worse poor the worse the poorer the working conditions become, the more inflation that you see, the less you're able to buy, the harder it is to provide for your family. This isn't the first time in history that this has happened, and if it continues to go this way, what's your prediction of the society we're going to live in? Maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 100 years, but like where is this going?
To your point, there's so many examples across the course of history where there are major economic disruptions and the impact that it has on people, the way that it drives inequities, and then the ultimate outcomes when those inequities get to a point where it's like this is no longer acceptable,
Mhm.
and I think we're at another one of those inflection points. And part of, I think, what we've been grappling with across the US is like this challenge of like, hey, so many aspects of what people are experiencing in their day-to-day lives are not okay and not working. And we have not, as a society, figured out a way to come up with a different structure for that. And there's been, I think I refer to it as like sort of like companies or industries that are well resourced and willing and able to make those investments. There have been all kinds of like innovations and, and what that work experience looks like. But there's not the flexibility or the resourcing to do that in the majority of US employers, right? I mean, like the majority of people across the US work in smaller workplaces, not Fortune 500 companies. And so it's
Yeah.
like great when you see the innovations and ways to think about care, but there are great examples and models where you can be a smaller or family owned or independent business and come up with ways of structuring work that really work for people.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Can you like give us some insights? Like, let's say you're running a small company or medium-sized company, regardless of what income level or demographic your workforce is, what makes a good workplace? And how do you build a good workplace? And how do you build a workplace that, from your perspective and from Empower Works perspective, is up to, call it par?
Yeah. Well, and I also want to get back to your question too about like, what does it look like in the future? Like, how can we, which I think that is a little bit of this is like, how do we build an economy that fundamentally values humans? I mean, I think that's the sort of, and you can use technology in so many ways to create conditions that keep what's human uniquely human and value one another and value people while also, thinking about doing things in different ways. And I think the challenge where we've been is there's I think been a lot of like, someone I know calls it like extractive technology or like extractive constructs where it's like, okay, I'm going to like get the most out of people, or I'm going to get the most out of this process, or I'm going to get the most out of this thing, because there's this, I think culturally in the US, there's this drive for like, how can I achieve more? Like, what does more look like? I want to have as much, like, it's all about kind of like, how do I maximize these things? And so that happens on the people side too. You're like, how do I maximize people? How do I maximize efficiency? How do I maximize? And I think if you flip the script on that a little bit and you're like, how do I maximize what's human? Ultimately, it's like sometimes you end up getting those pieces, like when you treat people as fundamentally like whole and resourceful and give them a high degree of agency, you end up with better business outcomes, and I think it's hard though in the cultural construct that we're in to necessarily see the path forward to, I think what we're all kind of, for lack of a better word, like programmed to be driving towards, which is like profit and, more gains, that like, oh, the way to get there is to like maximize and extract, what's possible. And I think there's a world in which we, especially thinking about, I mean, AI is already so disruptive and is going to be game changing in so many ways. There's a way to look at that from a fear based perspective. It's like, oh my gosh, like this is going to, there's going to be all this job loss. There's going to be, negative ramifications. I think about it in like, what does this open up that's fundamentally more human? Where are there aspects where we can invest in different ways? Like care is fundamentally human, like like, yes, like AI can do empathy and elements of that, but like someone else, but AI cannot be a hand on your shoulder caring for your elderly parent, like it's not there. There are just a lot of realms of our world in which the human is still going to be the most valuable. So I think to your question of like, how do we structure workplaces that work for people? It's kind of like centering those pieces. And we worked with the U.S. Surgeon General's office a couple of years ago to create, based in conversations and direct experiences of folks that we support, like what does well-being at work look like? And they provided this great framework. I actually haven't checked to see if it's still up. It's probably not up on government websites anymore, but in other areas. And it has a great and accessible framework of like, this is what people need. Here are ways, no matter the size of your structure of employment, to do those. And kind of the message I have, particularly for small employers, is like, it can feel really overwhelming. I think when the examples that you see in the world are like, oh my gosh, like, Google is doing X, Y, and Z. And you're like, well, I don't have the budget of Google, And you're like, okay, you don't have to have the budget of Google to create a healthy and an equitable work environment, where
Yeah.
people want
You
to.
don't need an emotional support pig or something like that, which
Right,
is a real I worked in a
really real thing.
building where yeah, you would get an emotional support pig. And I know this is like now we're talking about like, but there are real I realize that, that's a little tongue in cheek. But you made a point that stuck out to me. I have a friend that works in the service industry and in the restaurant industry, and he was making a point, which is that it's a very high turnover industry. But in the best restaurants, those that are incredibly successful, the turnover rate is actually quite low. And it's in the ones that are a little bit more middle of the road. And you could draw a parallel and say, well, if you're really best in class, your turnover rate is lower, and your turnover rate is lower because you're treating your employees better. And maybe you're best in class because if you treat your employees well, you're going to be a higher performing organization and operation, which was really your point.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people confuse that with like, if I'm treating my employees well, I'm not holding them accountable. I mean, you can be striving for big goals and working towards really ambitious outcomes and have a team, but like that's exciting for teams too, and you can do that in a kind and caring way and be working towards whatever those goals may be, whether that's like, you're the most successful local restaurant or it's like you can get folks aligned around that. And there are some really great models. I mean, in my neighborhood in San Francisco, there's a restaurant that, it's no tip. Every employee has access to retirement. Like they're all paid really great. I'm going to say really great. I actually don't know what their wages are. So, but like wages where there's low turnover
Mhm.
and, and they're really clear about it. They're like, this is part of the way that we've structured our business. And the experience of going there is really great. Like, it's just it feels good all around.
Yeah, it's nice to have places like that. Like sometimes there's also like old school restaurants where you go in and you talk to the waiter and yeah, I've worked here for 30 years and they take a lot of pride in the work that they've done. So it is possible, speaking specifically about the service industry. But don't you think it's kind of a larger trend outside of this like service industry or even manufacturing you mentioned or farming, like even in I'm thinking about the tech world now, again, being from San Francisco, like the turnover rate that you see in tech, even though they have emotional support pigs, is so high.
Well, I mean, I haven't worked in tech, so this is I don't want to speak from a non-direct experience, but I think there's a challenge again, kind of going back to that extractive piece where you do see these headlines of like, well, everybody has to work this many hours because that's your like maximum productivity. And you're like, I
Mhm.
mean, I don't know, is it like might be for somebody, but like for somebody else, they could be hugely impactful in their work in far fewer hours. Like I would rather have somebody on the team who's going to have incredible outcomes with a reasonable hour number of work. Like, I don't know. I mean, maybe this is just me, but I'm not great at 10 o'clock at night, like I'm not giving my best productivity at that point in the evening. So I'm skeptical that some of these like norms or pressures are actually, I don't know, aligned with any real outcomes that.
What would you say to somebody who's running a like a car body shop or a very small localized business that they're trying to feed their family, they're barely making ends meet, maybe, and I've heard this from people, is people don't want to work or they're lazy or they're not working hard enough. It's hard to find good people. That's something I've heard quite a bit in my interactions with people in my community, like you from local business owners. What would you say to them when they say, look, like we're trying, but we have high turnover. There's only so much we can pay. I'm trying to feed my family. And we're out here talking about, oh, I don't want to work at 10 p.m. Like, I got to put food on the plate. Like, what are we doing here? What would you say to them?
I mean, I would say I have deep empathy for that experience because I mean, in a way, like starting Empower Work, I mean, Empower Work is its own version of like a small business, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm like, I've been on the I've been on the, it's different in terms of it's a nonprofit, but it's like, I'm on the operator side of that part of the equation too. So I can understand the constraints and challenges around that. And in my family, like I grew up in Texas. My family had small businesses. So like my grandparents owned a lamp shop, and
Cool.
there are real considerations around the cost structure of that. What's your rent? Where, like what's the cost of labor? So my grandfather was like in the back fixing lamps and like doing electrical wiring and stuff. And like my grandmother was in the front doing the cash register and talking to customers and, things like that. So there are some real, like when you're talking about like, hey, we got to pay the bills, we got to cover these elements. That's a real pressure from a small business perspective, and the constraints that folks are facing, whether it's like the cost of the product or rent for the business, all of those are facets. So I don't think I could say to any business like, this is the way to do it. But I think there's an opportunity in the moment of that stress to take a step back and kind of go, okay, what are the factors that are at play here? And how can I get the support that I need for myself or the support that I need for my business to figure out a different path? Because in any situation where you're feeling like, hey, this isn't working for me, you probably need additional partnering, whether it's like the employee who's navigating something or the employer to kind of sort that out and to say, okay, like this is what I need to make this work. And I also really value compensating employees well and treating them in the ways that they want. And I'm not able to square those two things at the moment. Then I think that's an opportunity to kind of say, how do I square them? And if I can't figure out a path forward by myself, I need to like phone a friend, connect to the power work,
Yeah.
figure out how can I do this in an aligned way? Because in either case, whether you're the person who's experiencing it as the employee or the person who's the business owner going through it, like it doesn't feel great, and you want to figure out a way that is aligned with the way that you want to show up and figure out a path forward. So that's an unsatisfactory answer. It's a very like coaching based answer because it's like, it's different. It's unique for each group. But I think what's not unique is like, if you are in a situation where you're feeling stuck and you're not able to move forward in the way that you want to move forward, figuring out additional counsel. And it's hard when you're so stressed and overwhelmed to even realize that like, you know what, I probably need something else as part of this equation.
But it's interesting, and I appreciate that you're seeing it both from the perspective, which I hadn't prior to you answering this question, that there's empathy for both the employee of the business, and there is a power dynamic being a leader in a company, whether it's a very small company and you're a local, like car body shop to use the example, or you're running a restaurant. There is a power dynamic there. And so being a good leader, being a good steward of other people is very, 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 very important. But I appreciate that you have empathy for also those humans who are in those positions, maybe untrained, maybe haven't heard of Empower Work yet, but hopefully will soon.
I was just going to say that I think employees do too. Like from the Empower Work perspective, when folks are reaching out, like they have empathy for the situation a lot of times that they're in, And so I think for small business owners in particular, sometimes it can feel like, hey, I have to figure all this out. But I think there's a lot of times where folks who are part of your team want to help you figure that out. And sometimes that invitation hasn't been put out there,
I think that's a really good reminder, is that the employees of your business, and a lot of our listeners, not all of them, but many of them are founders, which is why I'd love to talk about founding a nonprofit. But I think it's an important thing to remember if you are in a leadership position, which most, if not all founders are. Your employees also understand the position that you're in, and they understand how hard it is, and inviting them into that vulnerability that you're probably facing could be a win all around. That could be a really good strategy to build a better workplace.
Yeah, definitely.
A lot of our listeners are going to be thinking about building a for-profit company, but some of our listeners are going to think about building a nonprofit. Before you talk to us about the difference of the two and how you go about it, I'm kind of curious, why did you decide to build this company specifically and a nonprofit specifically?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's very personally motivated. I mean, I'd had tough work experiences myself and had been committed to paying that forward in some way. Like I'd been in really gnarly and tricky situations where other folks had helped me. And I was like, gosh, I really want people to not face those kind of situations. And in the event that they do, I want to make sure that I'm there for folks. And then I think in a lot of cases, people then have that moment where you're like, I'm not scalable. I mean, I did, but I didn't even think I was good at it. Like there was someone who connected with me in 2017, and we were having a late night conversation. And at the end of that conversation, I was like, oh my gosh, like I hope that I was helpful, like, but that was kind of beyond my set of what I felt like I could really provide support around. And it felt like that person in particular needed something that was much more proximate to the situation they were going through and more knowledgeable, than
Mm,
me. And so I was kind of like, ooh, what should I have in my back pocket to refer people to that's not tied to the employer? Because again, there are employer resources in some cases where people work, but I was like, what, there's gotta be something that's like third party that's available, um, that I can know about and make sure that other people know about too. And I spent, like, I don't know, a couple hours Googling and like, what would I Google and what would the search terms be? And I couldn't find anything. And so that
mhm.
really led me on this question of like, why doesn't something exist? And what are the pieces of that? And ultimately, like why something doesn't exist is because there's a market failure. Like for companies willing and able to pay their resources, but the vast majority of folks that we talked about already, like don't work in those situations. And um, those companies aren't willing and able to pay. And that creates this really significant gap. So I was like, how do we fill that gap? What does that look like? And that could be a for-profit structure, it could be a nonprofit structure, but in the context of like, hey, there's a bit of a market failure. It's like companies where or places where folks are most likely experiencing these negative things and don't have resources, that company is never really going to pay, and
Yeah.
so that kind of leads to where should that live? And I think if we have this promise in the US that a job is your path to opportunity, that's like, hey, we're the greatest country in the world in order to be entrepreneurial, in order to like achieve, prosperity.
Yes.
Like that promise is employment. But when you have this driving inequity of like you work at a place that is willing and able to invest in you, great. But when the vast majority of employment doesn't have the means or, sometimes the interest to do it, then you end up with this like widening gap. And so we created Empower Work to be that third party that didn't exist.
Well, you know what's interesting, and a lot of founders don't know this either, is you are an employee of your business as a founder, and for all employees, the resources the company provides, including the council, HR team, whatever, is there to represent the entity of the business.
Oh,
They are
yeah.
first and foremost protecting the business. And your gripe about your personal issues will be seen from the light of, is this a liability to the business? That's true if you're the founder and CEO of the business and have no other employees. You are still at odds with this entity that you created, and it is looking out for the interest of that entity. And I don't know if a lot of people realize that. I think a lot of people think I'm going to go to my HR department and they're here to help me. But there may be good people working in that department, don't get me wrong. But their job is to represent the company.
Oh, yeah. I
So, like,
actually,
where do you go?
one of the very first articles that ever, like, the first like pieces that ever mentioned Empower Work, the title was HR has lost the trust of employees. Here's who has it now. And it's true. I mean, I think like fundamentally the structure of systems like HR are in and of themselves like uh, in a bind because they are trying to kind of like play both sides, right? Like they're there and they're structured to represent the business interests, to your point. But there are creative ways in which it's been presented, like, oh, but they also represent the needs of employees. And I think when you're trying to in really well constructed companies, I think sometimes they can get it right. And that role can deftly navigate interest of the business and interest of the employer, interest of the outcomes of the business, et cetera. But that's a fine line to walk. And it's not, I think for the cases that we support in Empower Work, like sometimes the path is like, go connect with HR, they're a trusted resource, have a conversation about it, raise these concerns. And that might be an available pathway. I think in other cases, there's no HR or it doesn't make sense. And yeah, I think there's a real opportunity to like rethink what the whole construct is, but that's like a much larger conversation.
Yes, it is. But I think conceptually, well, and you pointed this earlier in the conversation as well, is in a well-functioning organization, the company is interested in providing a great workspace. And so if you're an HR employee, you could see yourself saying, or you can see the leadership in the company saying that our HR's team is here to make our workplace great, which in turn helps us build a great company. Yes. And so if you have a problem or an issue, we're providing a way for you to voice that. If you have a suggestion, we have a way for you to voice that. If there's something that will make the workplace better, or there's an issue or something that needs to be resolved, we give you the resources to help you do that because it makes the workplace better. Absolutely. But it's still about the workplace being better. And that was such a shock to me, Jamie-Alexis. Like that was when I found that out, like once I realized like the company's not always on your team. And that's a really, really, really difficult way to live, because it's like, I thought we were all in this together.
Well, and I mean, what you're pointing to is like, what should our expectation of employers be? And I think we sort of have like indexed, like we were talking earlier about sort of this extractive element. I think we've also put, in some cases, like too much responsibility or expectation on the employer. Like your employer is not necessarily responsible for your career trajectory, for example, or like, and you could have a great manager who cares about you personally. And my argument should be that employers should and managers should, be a partner and a team member in that. But I think like we've put so many different responsibilities on employers because there are sort of deficits in other areas, and I mean, there, this might be like a little bit controversial, but I'll say like, because we don't have a universal healthcare or like other health, like we've increasingly put more burden on employers to be the source of like healthcare. Okay, well now that's like mental health care. That's like you're adding on like more and more of these layers that are also tied to people's well-being. And so it's reasonable, I think, for employees to be like, gosh, like all of these aspects of my life are connected to my employer. And so then there's this expectation of like, well, like if something's not working for me, then I'm expecting the employer to solve it. But if you take a step back and like, well, what's a reasonable expectation for an employer? It's like a great working environment. It's like meaningful work. It's connectivity. It's like you want that pay equity. Like you want the elements that align with what a workplace provide. And they're also not going to necessarily be the place where like if you're like, gosh, I can't decide whether or not I want to take this opportunity or that opportunity. Like you're not going to go to the HR person or like your employer and be like, help me with this career decision. Again, great manager, you would, but I think there are kind of like expectations on both sides of the equation that we can rethink and have an opportunity to say like, what is a reasonable expectation for an employer? I think we should hold them to higher accounts in a lot of ways. That being said, I think there are different ways that we can structure overall how we build workplaces and the structure of work so that there are less like things that employers have jumped through. I'll just give my own example around this. Like,
please.
It's really difficult to be an employer in the US to navigate lots of different state specific components.
Taxes, laws,
like paid leave. Okay, I've got employees in this state where there's no paid leave, but I have employees in this state. And that complexity for especially like a small business or even like a larger business to navigate resources in a direction that doesn't necessarily serve the employees, because then the business is trying to solve for like, okay, I've got to navigate like all these different, state-based specific things. It's like, well, what if we had a different construct for that made it easier for companies to have employees across every state, how much better would that be for the US so that you could hire in lots of different states and you could have the flexibility to ensure that every employee has paid leave no matter what state they're in, but you're not as a business then responsible for the cost differential. Like in California, I know that California is going to cover part of that paid leave, but if I have an employee in this other state that doesn't have paid leave, then I'm having to build that into the business cost. I mean, that's like business hoop jumping that like you shouldn't have to like that like you shouldn't have to spend time on, right? That's like you're spending time on that. Yes, you're creating a more equitable workplace in a way because you're trying to make sure that those needs are covered for your employees. But what is that taking you away from in other areas because you're having to navigate all of that?
True. But
Yeah.
now you're getting into the territory of like, do states have sovereignty and like,
Oh my gosh, I know. I'm like, what? Like,
yeah.
big, but I think like surfacing that there are pain points on the
Mhm.
employer and employee side, and we can come up with a better way to address these. And I think that's where I'm kind of like, where's the entrepreneurial creativity where we can say like, you know what, we need a different system for this. And if we really want, businesses to be thriving and we really want, people to be thriving and be able to work in great workplaces, we have to fundamentally rethink the structures for how we're building businesses, for how we're, supporting the building of those businesses. And then give the flexibility and creativity to really reimagine what the larger ecosystem looks like.
Well, hopefully somebody listening to this is thinking about how to make some of the changes that you just talked about. But
Yeah,
let
well,
me get your take on
talk
something.
to me about it. This is a moment where I'm like, a lot of things are blowing up, so like this is a moment to kind of look at like what could the other side look like. So I'm very eager to have those types of conversations.
How hard is it to run Empower Work, like a nonprofit and a space that is very dear to your heart? You obviously have a lot of experience with it. You mentioned that it's also personal for you. Like, what's it like running that company?
I'm going to say on one hand, it's like the most fulfilling work that I've ever done, waking up every day and it feels like a privilege to be able to say like, oh my gosh, like we changed lives today. I mean, that's a huge element of meaning, to be able to do this work and feels, gives me a lot of energy. Gives me a lot of meaning. And, it's also really hard because it's like when you care about the work so much, it is the kind of situation where you're up in the middle of the night thinking about it and you're up, early, like making sure that things are covered that need to get covered. And it's hard to turn things off and to give your brain a break and to give your body a break from the sort of like living the work all the time. And I feel really fortunate that I have a partner who also has started a couple different things, but also a nonprofit and like understands what that looks like. And he said to me when I was first starting Empower Work, this is like, it's kind of a marathon, not a sprint. And I was like, oh, 100%, because we've both run marathons, so we understand that context of like when someone's at like the 13-mile mark and they're like, you're almost there. And you're like, oh man, I'm not almost there. Like this is, I have
Don't
half
lie
the
to me.
race ahead, but it is, you're really needing to think about like, what's the long game and how do I approach the day today, knowing that there are a lot of hurdles ahead and that there's a longer path forward, and doing that regular check-in to be like, what do I need? What does the team need? What does the organization need? Because this is it. The work is hard and you have to be able to show up every day and make sure that like, I'll say I have to make sure I'm okay. The team is okay. Like,
Yeah.
because ultimately like that's what we I say to the team, I'm like, that's what we want to do. Like, we want to live our mission internally in the same way that we're supporting other people to live in that mission. And that takes work and learning and getting things wrong and acknowledging when you get it wrong.
Can you talk about like being an entrepreneur, having a partner? You've also been a partner to an entrepreneur. Adam's built many businesses, including the nonprofit. Like, what's important in supporting your partner? How do you support your partner, and what do you look for um in your partner's support, and vice versa? Like, how do you be a good partner to somebody who's putting their life's work into a mission?
Yeah. When Adam and I first started dating, I said to some of my friends, like, my gosh, I feel like we embrace the world in the same way. And they were like, that's a really like unspecific way. What does that really mean? You know? And I was like, like
Yeah.
we like embrace the world in the same way. But I think what that looks like is, an understanding that they're constantly trade-offs and there's constantly kind of a cognitive load around decision making and thinking through what has to get done at any given point. And so I really value being able to be real with him and be like, oh
Hmm.
my gosh, like, in really great moments where you're like, oh my gosh, this huge thing just happened. And like, this is so great to be able to celebrate those moments where it's like, gosh,
Yes.
like, yeah, I know when things are really hard and that great thing comes through that like, I know what that feeling is like and can like
Yes.
appreciate it and kind of be there in the moment with you, which is really valuable. And to hold you account when you don't celebrate it enough, because I think as an entrepreneur, you're like, oh, we like, gosh, we like hit this big goal or we like got this fundraising or, whatever it is. And you're kind of like, okay, great. Like what's happening tomorrow? And you have a partner
I
who's
suffer from this affliction. I understand that very
now
well.
like, it's sort of like have a partner who's like, wait, can we like take a moment and be celebratory of this thing? Cause like, that's huge, and when you're really hard on yourself, cause there are times, like, oh my gosh, we haven't like gotten to this or we like,
Hmm.
because as an entrepreneur, you're constantly like, how do I
Yes.
get it to the next place? How do I serve more people? How do I increase our impact? Like, all these things. And to have a partner who's like, hey, I hear where you're coming from on that. And also like, can you kind of appreciate for a moment that like, oh my gosh, like you built this thing and you've helped 500,000 people. Like that's, yes, you want to serve 3 million and like, you're not there yet, but like take a moment, just be like, a lot of folks don't even get to that point, And so I really value having Adam as a partner in being able to, listen and wrangle with all those things and, and a team that understands those pieces too and is excited to do that work together.
Yeah, I mean, the celebrating win thing really hits home for me because it's more about the journey, at least for me, and I wonder for others as well, where you're thinking like, I'm really enjoying the work it takes to accomplish something. And because that's so fun, as soon as you get to the next milestone, you're already like, well, I'm already been thinking about what's going to come after that. And I like being in the pursuit of the next thing. And then you forget to celebrate. And I realized in my journey that that's really, really tough on your partner at home.
Mm-hmm.
But that's also really, really tough for your team at work
Yeah.
and the people you work with. And I really had to reflect on that in these last few years, how important it is to celebrate the wins. I'm not good at it. And hearing that you have a support system, a mutual one, it sounds like, that allows you to do that that's amazing.
River once doing I don't know if you've ever done StrengthsFinder, but I
No.
did StrengthsFinder, at one point and came back and like one of my strengths was like achiever is and I was like achiever, like I'm not ever someone who's like I want to win awards or whatever, like that's not motivating for me. And so I was like that's the wrong, like that's not right. And then I read the description and it was like actually it's someone who it's kind of like, okay, you get to the top of the mountain and you're just like, okay, where's the next mountain? Like you're just like, you want to go tackle things and you don't pause to
Mhm.
appreciate what you've just tackled. You're just constantly like, hey, I want to like help more people. I want to, it's like you want to achieve a goal. So not necessarily like achievement winning things, but it's like, hey, I want to knock this out. I was like, oh, that's very real. And then it talks about how that can impact if you're a leader, how you impact, like how it can impact a team that you're managing. Because for you, you're like, hey, I just want to like, great, we hit the thing, like on to the next. And it's like, yeah, but if you have folks on your team who have different strengths and you're not pausing to sort of acknowledge that moment or the achievement or the win, like you're not bringing your team along with you. And that's been really helpful to reflect on like, what are my strengths that have helped me be entrepreneurial and like creative and things like that. And those are awesome to get us where we are, but also like where have they made me a less effective manager,
Mhm.
a less effective leader because I, think about things in certain ways that may or may not be the way that everyone on the team thinks about things. And so I have to step back and be like, hey, okay, how do I pause and acknowledge that like I've got to bring everybody else along too?
This has been really insightful. How do people get in touch with you? How do they get in touch with Empower Work, and maybe just to help those who are looking for resources like yours? What's the best way for them to access your services at Empower Work? And I think it's worth pointing out that it's all free.
Yeah. So for anyone who needs support, like an individual who needs support, there's no barrier to entry for that. We do have paid community and workforce and other partners, which is basically we provide support for communities in a paid way where they pay for our services to provide to their community, not directly through employers. But for any of those options, if folks are like, oh my gosh, like I'm part of a community that needs support, I want to get in touch with Empower Work about that. I personally need support. I want to give back and volunteer. Best thing to do is go to the website, which is empowerwork.org, and you can see opportunities to say, oh, I want to partner with your organization. I want to volunteer, or like, yes, I want to text with someone right now and do something. And, I think for those who have had these types of experiences and recognize, I think there are always folks who are like, gosh, like I've gone through something really tough, or I've experienced something that set me back in my career, and I'm now at a different point. There are also ways to give back. If you don't have time to volunteer, you can always make a donation too, which helps us keep it free for folks who may not otherwise be able to pay for something.
And for those that are interested in donating, what's the best way to get in touch?
On our website, you can you go to, I think there's like a button in the right-hand side that says donate. But you can also reach out to our team. We have if none of those cover what you need, we have a team at empowerwork.org email, and that goes always to the right person to help solve. So you're like, I have questions about volunteering, or I have questions about partnership, or I have questions about donating, or, we've had situations where we've had like anonymous Bitcoin donors, for example. Like, it's like you can donate Bitcoin on the website, but you could also just email our team and we can figure it out. So it's there are lots of opportunities to get involved.
Amazing. Well, for all my Bitcoiners out there,
I know
you guys will donate.
But it was pivotal.
Generously.
Guess where we are. There was a Bitcoin donor called the Pineapple Fund very early in
yes, I know about the Pineapple Fund.
Yeah, and it was game changing for Empower Work. We just started. One of our board members pinged me. I was at a playground with my kids, or at that point I had one kid. And the board member was like, have you heard about this? It looks like they care about things that we're doing in Empower Work. And I mean, that's those types of kind of communal actions are really where that would have helped get Empower Work to where we are today. And I emailed the Pineapple Fund, and they wrote back a couple of questions and gave us $100,000, and it was game changing. And I still don't know who that was, and I'm forever grateful. So it was, there are really foundational and pivotal moments like that happen that you just can't anticipate in your journey of getting something off the ground. And you're like, but this is why it really is like a collective effort.
Shout out to the early Bitcoiners for supporting such a great cause. And thank you to you, Jamie-Alexis, for taking the time with me today and for walking us through this and for giving us the insight. I know you're very busy, so taking your time to explain what you do to our listeners and answering my questions was really insightful for me, and I'm sure for everybody listening.
I appreciate it, Arthur. It's so great to chat, and hope that folks find some meaning in the conversation today. And if anyone's inspired to connect more, you can find me on LinkedIn too, or email the team at Empower Work email, because I always love talking to people who care about this work.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur.